She didn't speak. Not when they left. Not when the snow began to fall. Not even when she was tied to the bus stop with nothing but a scarf and a silent prayer. But somehow the world listened. A teacher saw her. A boy remembered her. And an old man, long hardened by grief, felt something melt inside. She never said a word. Because she didn't need to. Scout was sent not to bark, but to stay. Watch how one quiet dog healed a school, a town, and maybe even you. The winter morning settled over Brattleboro, Vermont, like a thick, solemn hush. Snow clung to the skeletal trees along Main Street and blanketed the rooftops in a muted white, softening every edge of the sleepy town. Street lamps still glowed a faint amber, casting halos through the flurries that continued to fall like breathless whispers. At 6:52 a.m., the only sound breaking the silence was the occasional crunch of tires over fresh snow and the slow creak of school doors opening for another day. Amelia Harris pulled into the nearly empty lot of Brattleboro Elementary School, her old Subaru groaning in protest against the cold. She stepped out, hugging her woolen coat tighter around her tall, slender frame. At 38, Amelia carried herself with a quiet steadiness, the kind built from seasons of showing up, even on the hardest days. Her face bore gentle lines at the corners of her green eyes, the sort that came from smiling more often than frowning, but there was something about her that always seemed just slightly guarded. Losing her younger sister to cancer a decade earlier had shaped her in subtle ways, an unspoken ache woven into her kindness, a patience carved by grief. She wore her long chestnut hair pulled back in a low twist, practical yet elegant, and her breath hung in the air as she balanced a travel mug of black coffee and a leather satchel stuffed with graded papers and construction paper cutouts. She didn't see it at first. Her eyes were on the walkway, careful of ice. But as she turned toward the front of the school, her gaze caught something unusual across the street, right at the school bus stop. A small figure, unmoving, nestled into the snowbank like a statue carved in shadow. Amelia squinted. It was too still for a child. She stepped closer, heart starting to tap faster against her ribs. And then she saw him. A German Shepherd puppy, barely 4 months old by the look of him. His fur, soaked and matted from the snow, was a deep sable with patches of black around his eyes and ears. His ears were too big for his head, flopped slightly forward, and his paws were awkwardly large, a clumsy promise of the big dog he would grow into. Around his neck was a frayed green scarf, clearly a child's, with little silver stars stitched unevenly along the hem. There was something else too, a plastic clip holding a folded note just beneath the scarf. Amelia's breath caught. She moved slowly, boots crunching the thin sheet of snow beneath her. The puppy didn't bark, didn't run. He just watched her with wide, deep brown eyes full of something too complex for words. Sadness? Hope? Resignation? She crouched slowly, her voice low and warm. Hey, sweetheart, where's your person? With shaking hands, she unclipped the note and opened it. The paper was wrinkled, but the handwriting was steady, block letters that seemed to tremble on the page. His name is Scout. He's gentle and loyal. Please take care of him. That was all. No phone number. No name. No explanation. Just trust. Raw and heartbreaking. Scout leaned his small frame against her knee, his tail wagging slowly like he was trying to be brave. Amelia felt her throat tighten as she slipped one hand beneath his belly to lift him. He was light, too light, and she could feel the outline of his ribs through his damp fur. He sighed softly as she cradled him to her chest, burying his face into the wool of her coat as though the world might vanish behind her heartbeat. From across the parking lot, a figure watched in silence. George Whitman stood just inside the janitor's entrance of the school building, leaning on the handle of a metal snow shovel. At 67, he was a wiry man with a weathered face and a permanent stoop from decades of physical work. His beard, once russet, was now mostly gray, trimmed neatly but always dusted with whatever grit the day had thrown at him. He wore a brown Carhartt coat, a Red Sox beanie pulled over his ears, and heavy boots scuffed at the toes. Most of the staff thought of George as quiet and gruff, efficient and solitary. He rarely spoke unless spoken to and never lingered in the teacher's lounge longer than he needed. But today, as he watched Amelia cradle the wet puppy and walk briskly toward the front doors, something in George shifted. His hand, still gripping the shovel, loosened slightly. His gaze dropped to the scarf around the puppy's neck and lingered there. His throat worked once, tightly, as a memory clawed its way forward, Rocky. His German Shepherd, his companion for 12 years, gone 2 winters ago to kidney failure. George had buried himself behind the shed and hadn't spoken his name out loud since. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just turned slowly and resumed salting the front steps. But his shoulders hunched differently now, lower, like a burden was settling in again. Inside, Amelia moved quickly. She wrapped Scout in the old fleece blanket she kept in her trunk for emergencies and turned on the portable space heater beside her desk. Her classroom smelled of pine-scented disinfectant and drying glue, and paper snowflakes still hung in the windows. Scout didn't make a sound. He lay curled beneath her desk, one eye open, tracking her movements like she was the only certainty left in the world. The first bell rang at 7:30. Children tumbled into the room in layers of wool, snow pants, and boots too big for their feet. Amelia greeted them as usual, but their eyes went wide when they spotted Scout, his ears perking just slightly at the commotion. "Ms. Harris, is that your dog?" one of them exclaimed. Amelia smiled faintly. "His name is Scout. He's staying with us for today. Let's be gentle, okay?" Scout didn't bark, didn't flinch. He simply looked up with those calm, searching eyes. When one shy boy, Oliver Reynolds, a quiet child with sandy hair and a perpetual look of worry, sat cross-legged nearby, Scout lifted his head and inched closer, resting his chin on the boy's knee. Oliver froze. Then, after a long breath, his small hand reached out and touched the fur gently. Scout stayed perfectly still. George came in an hour later to change the air filters and mop the back corner of the classroom. He paused when he saw Scout. The puppy turned his head toward the door and met George's eyes for a long second. "Didn't expect to see one of you again," George murmured under his breath. Then louder, toward Amelia. "That your dog?" "No," Amelia said softly, her voice careful. "Found him at the bus stop. Someone left a note." George gave a slow nod. "Looks like he's been through a lot." Then he got back to work. He didn't say anything more. But as he walked out, he glanced once more at Scout, and something unreadable flickered in his expression. By the end of the day, Scout had become part of the room. Students read aloud with him nearby. Oliver drew a picture of him with crayon, carefully coloring the green scarf. Amelia stayed late after dismissal, sitting quietly beside the heater, Scout curled up at her feet. She thought about the note, about the person who had left Scout there in the cold, not with cruelty, but with love desperate enough to let go. Outside, snow began to fall again, fine and silver. In the janitor's office, George sat alone with a cup of tea, staring at an old photo tacked to the wall. It showed a younger man in overalls, kneeling beside a full-grown German shepherd. His hand reached up, touched the edge of the frame. Then he looked out the small window toward the classroom, where light still spilled warm onto the snow. Scout had come in from the cold, and though no one knew it yet, something had quietly shifted in more than one heart that day. The next morning brought no reprieve from the cold, but the snow had stopped. The sky above Brattleboro was a dull pewter gray, heavy with unshed clouds, while the schoolyard crunched underfoot with a fresh crust of ice. Amelia Harris arrived early again, her long coat flaring behind her as she walked briskly toward her classroom. Tucked inside a thick wool blanket in her arms was Scout, his head poking out with sleepy, curious eyes. The puppy had spent the night curled up on her couch, nestled against an old Afghan that still smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Amelia hadn't planned to keep him overnight. She'd even Googled local shelters before bed. But when she looked into those dark, trusting eyes, the idea of leaving him anywhere else had felt wrong. Scout had changed overnight. He was still thin, still quiet, but he followed her now with more confidence, tail swaying gently, as if testing its ability to wag freely. Amelia lowered him onto the reading rug in the back corner of the room, and watched as he circled twice and flopped down with a soft huff. The heater hummed nearby, and the space, though still waking from its own cold slumber, felt warm in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. By 8 o'clock, the classroom buzzed with energy. Students peeled off snow gear, voices rising in their usual morning chatter, until they saw Scout. A hush fell, quickly replaced by delighted whispers. "He's back! Look, he's still here." Amelia knelt beside him. "Remember what we talked about?" Calm voices, gentle hands. They listened. Something about Scout brought out their better selves. Oliver Reynolds, the quiet boy from the day before, arrived last. As always, he hovered at the door for a few seconds before entering. 8 years old, slight of frame, with a mop of unbrushed sandy hair and large glasses that always slid down his nose, Oliver had a permanent posture of hesitation. His anxiety made him slow to speak, slow to move. He preferred sitting alone, often coloring the same shapes over and over. But today, as he saw Scout lying peacefully beside the bookcase, something flickered in him. Without prompting, Oliver walked to his desk, set down his bag, and then sat on the carpet near Scout. The puppy raised his head. Their eyes met. Scout inched forward and placed one paw lightly over Oliver's shoe. Oliver smiled. It was barely visible, more like a twitch at the edge of his mouth, but Amelia saw it. She kept the lesson simple that morning, a reading circle with hot cocoa and soft music. Scout remained at the center, like a living hearth around which the children settled. Even those who normally fidgeted or interrupted were hushed in his presence. When Oliver raised his hand to read a paragraph from Charlotte's Web, Amelia nearly dropped her pen. He read slowly, stumbling on a few words, but his voice didn't shake. Scout rested his head on Oliver's crossed legs, and the boy's hand moved gently across the dog's fur as he read. At lunch, while the students filed out to the cafeteria, Amelia lingered behind, clearing mugs and stacking books. She didn't notice George Whitman until he knocked twice on the open door with the handle of his broom. He stood there, stoic as always, his salt and pepper beard frosted from clearing snow. "Got something for the dog," he said simply. Amelia turned, eyebrows raised. "You do?" George stepped aside and leaned down to reveal a short wooden crate. It was sturdy, made from cedar planks and lined with an old flannel sheet. A small plaque on the front had been carved with a pocket knife, Scout. "Figured he might need a proper place to lie down," George muttered. "Didn't seem right, him sleeping on the floor." Amelia knelt beside it, her eyes softening. "Did you make this last night?" George shrugged. "Had some extra wood. Not a big deal. But it was. More than he knew." "Thank you," she said. "It means a lot." He grunted and stepped back into the hallway, but not before Scout padded over to sniff the new bed. The puppy climbed in, circled once, and laid down with a satisfied groan. George watched him for a second, his face unreadable. "Looks like he approves," Amelia said with a smile. "Smart dog," George replied, then added quieter. "Reminds me of one I had." Amelia didn't press. She just nodded. "You ever want to stop in and say hi? I think he'd like that." George didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on Scout for a moment before he disappeared down the hall, mop bucket in tow. That afternoon, Amelia introduced a journal writing activity. Write about a time you felt safe. Most kids groaned, but Oliver, pencil clutched tightly in one hand, began writing almost immediately. Amelia walked past his desk and caught the first line. "I feel safe when Scout is near me because he doesn't ask questions. He just stays." During recess, while most kids bundled up to brave the icy playground, Amelia let Oliver stay inside. He sat cross-legged on the rug with Scout's head in his lap, drawing pictures with colored pencils. Scout with a cape, Scout flying through clouds, Scout smiling. "Does he get to stay forever?" Oliver asked without looking up. "I don't know yet," Amelia said honestly. "But I hope so." Outside, George stood by the side of the school building, breaking up an ice patch near the gutter with a steel shovel. He paused to listen to the sounds of children echoing across the field, laughter, snowball fights, the squeal of a sled. Then he turned toward the classroom window, where Scout and Oliver sat like twin shadows outlined in gold. He leaned on the shovel handle for a moment, as if the weight of it was easier to carry today. When the final bell rang, and students raced to meet buses or parents, Amelia remained behind to gather her things. Scout stayed at her side, occasionally trotting toward the door and back again, curious but content. She clipped his leash to his collar, and was halfway down the hall when she passed George again. "I owe you for the bed," she said. George shook his head. "Nah, just glad he's got a spot." Then after a pause he added, "You keep him or what?" "I think he found us more than we found him," Amelia said. "Still figuring it out." George nodded, then looked at Scout. "Dog like that, he knows where he belongs." As Amelia stepped out into the dusk, snow beginning to fall again in soft, silent flakes, Scout stayed close by her leg. The cold nipped at their skin, but inside, there was warmth growing in places none of them had expected. The following week opened with a sharp drop in temperature. Vermont's winter deepened its hold on Brattleboro, the wind biting harder, the trees now encased in silvery ice. Icicles dripped slowly from the school's eaves, glittering in the pale morning sun like forgotten ornaments. Inside the school, warmth flickered in small, steady ways, murmurs of students reading aloud, the distant clang of cafeteria trays, and most notably, Scout's quiet footsteps as he padded after Amelia from hallway to classroom. Each morning now began the same. Amelia would arrive early, her arms filled with books and lesson plans, Scout trotting beside her, ears alert and tail slightly raised. He was healthier now, his coat glossier, his eyes brighter. Amelia had started feeding him a special blend of kibble and boiled chicken, and the difference was visible. But despite his growing comfort, there remained a certain watchfulness in Scout, a readiness, as though he were still waiting for someone. It was that persistent air of searching that nudged Amelia to begin looking for answers. That Tuesday afternoon, after the students had gone and Scout was napping under the reading nook, Amelia sat at her desk, examining the green scarf that had come with him. It was frayed along the edges, the fabric soft with wear. Embroidered in careful, slightly crooked stitches near one corner was a name, Benny. It was the only real clue she had. Not much, but maybe enough. She started with the school secretary, Linda Braverman, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with perfectly ironed blouses and a fondness for gossip disguised as administrative efficiency. Linda had worked at Brattleboro Elementary for over 2 decades and remembered almost every child who had passed through. Benny, she repeated, tapping her chin with a candy-red fingernail. Oh sure, Benny Combs. Sweet kid. Big brown eyes. Lived over on Willow Lane. They moved out a few months ago, October, I think. His mom, Natalie, worked at the diner until they shut it down. Rough situation. Amelia nodded, noting it all down. Do you have a forwarding address? Linda shook her head. Afraid not. She didn't leave one, just said they were heading south, maybe to Rutland. Said her sister might help them get back on their feet. Later that day, during her planning period, Amelia approached the bus depot, located in a small lot behind the school gym. There she found Cheryl Mathers, one of the veteran drivers, finishing her afternoon route paperwork. Cheryl was a short, stocky woman with weathered skin, a thick New England accent, and a voice that could cut through any playground noise. She wore her signature puffy purple jacket and a Red Sox beanie covered in enamel pins. Scout, huh? She said when Amelia introduced the dog. Scout sniffed her hand politely. I remember seeing him. Sat at that bus stop for days, like clockwork. Always looking down the street. Thought he must belong to someone nearby. Didn't have a leash, but he didn't run off either. Just waited. Amelia told her about the scarf. Cheryl's brow furrowed. Yeah, that kid, Benny. He used to ride my bus. Wouldn't say much, but he'd always pet Scout before getting on. Talked to him like they were brothers. Poor kid must have had to let him go. As Amelia thanked her and turned to leave, she glanced back at Scout. He was sitting quietly, staring down the road, ears forward. Still watching. That evening, Amelia and Scout walked home beneath a dusky sky. Light flurries began to fall again, dusting Scout's back like powdered sugar. At the corner of her street, they passed George Whitman. He was salting the icy sidewalk in front of the school, his movements slow but practiced, a knit scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. You're out late, he grunted as they approached. Just taking the long way home, Amelia replied. She hesitated, then asked, Did you ever have to let go of someone before you were ready? George didn't answer at first. He leaned on his shovel, his gaze fixed on the salt as it scattered across the pavement. Then he said, My boy, Ben, left town when he was 20. We'd fought bad, things you can't unsay. Haven't spoken in 12 years. Amelia looked at him quietly. The wind tugged at her coat. I don't even know where he is now, George added, his voice lower. But every time I see that dog looking out the window, part of me remembers what it felt like to watch someone walk away. Scout walked up to him then, tail swaying. He pressed his nose to George's boot and let out a quiet exhale. I still got his baseball glove in my attic, George murmured. Never had the heart to throw it out. Amelia placed a hand on George's arm, just briefly. Some things are worth holding on to. They parted with no more words, just the soft crunch of snow behind them. Back home, Amelia made herself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch with Scout at her feet. Her laptop rested on her knees. She searched for Natalie Combs, Rutland, Vermont. Several results came up, but none clear. She clicked through forums, Facebook pages, old phone listings. It was like chasing smoke. She was about to give up when she stumbled across a public post on a community message board. It was short and almost desperate, looking for any leads. Lost our dog Scout in Brattleboro. Had to move and couldn't take him. 9 son devastated. Please message if found. Natalie C. The post was dated 5 weeks ago. Amelia's heart kicked. She hit reply. The next morning, before the bell, George stopped by her room with a small wooden picture frame. It held a photo of a young man, college-aged, with a wide smile and dark hair, holding a baseball glove in one hand and a German shepherd in the other. Figured Scout might want to meet Rocky, George said, placing the photo gently on the shelf above Scout's bed. Scout sniffed it once, then curled back up in his wooden crate as if it had always been there. The morning after Amelia replied to the online post, the school buzzed with its usual rhythm. Children stomping snow from their boots, the radiator clanking in protest, papers fluttering under fans. But beneath the surface of that familiar noise, Amelia felt a different sort of energy humming through her. She kept checking her phone, heart nudging her each time it buzzed, half hoping, half dreading that Natalie Combs would write back. Scout seemed to sense something had shifted. He was more alert that morning, following Amelia closer than usual, his ears twitching at every sound. When she stopped by the classroom windows to pull up the blinds, he stood beside her, staring out at the snowy street as if searching for something he couldn't name. At 8:13 a.m., while the students settled into their morning reading, her phone finally vibrated with a message notification. She slipped it from her pocket and read the screen. "Hi. I just saw your reply. Is Scout okay? Please tell me he's safe. My son still cries every night." Natalie Amelia stepped into the hallway to respond. She leaned against the cool plaster wall and took a steadying breath. "He's safe. He's here with me. He's healthy, warm, and very loved. Your post helped me find you. Can we talk?" A few minutes later, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was quiet and hesitant. Natalie Combs was in her early 30s, soft-spoken with the slightest southern lilt, something not native to Vermont. She had moved to Brattleboro from North Carolina 10 years ago, chasing a job and a fresh start, but life had tugged her backward more often than forward. Since losing her job at the diner, she'd moved in with her sister in Rutland, sharing a cramped apartment with her son Benny. She apologized over and over, her words weighted by shame. "I didn't want to let Scout go," she said. "But the shelter near here wouldn't take him unless I surrendered him permanently. I thought, maybe if I left him where someone kind would find him." "You did what you had to," Amelia said gently. "You trusted someone to care for him. That took courage." They talked for nearly an hour. Natalie cried when Amelia described how Scout had curled up beside Oliver during reading time, how he walked through the halls like he belonged, how even the school janitor had built him a bed. Then Amelia heard the quiet voice of a child in the background. "Is that Scout's teacher?" Benny asked. Natalie's voice softened. "Yes, baby. It's her." Benny, 8 years old, was small for his age, with a face that still held baby fat and large, serious eyes. He didn't speak often, not since they'd moved. Scout had been his best friend, the only constant during a time when everything else fell apart. When Scout didn't follow them into the car that cold morning, Benny had assumed his mother would bring him later. Only days later did the truth settle in. "Can I tell her something?" Benny whispered. Natalie handed him the phone. "Hi," his voice trembled. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep Scout. I just want him to be happy." Amelia's throat closed. "He is, Benny. And he misses you. He hasn't stopped looking for you. But I promise he's okay." They ended the call with no clear plan. Natalie thanked her again and again, but admitted she had no means to take Scout back yet. Amelia didn't push. She knew stability couldn't be rushed. Later that afternoon, the clouds rolled in heavy and low. Snow began to fall again, thick, determined flakes that blanketed the town in silence. As children bundled up for dismissal, George Whitman pushed open the back door to begin shoveling. Scout trotted out with him, tail flicking lightly as he followed the old man down the walkway. George paused at the salt bucket and leaned on his shovel. "You again," he murmured, glancing down at the dog. "You really don't miss a moment, do you?" Scout sat in the snow beside him. George reached down and scratched behind his ears. "I ever tell you about Ben?" he asked. "My son. He was stubborn. Like his mother. He wanted to be a musician. I wanted him to get a real job. We said things, mean things. He left that night. Never looked back." The shovel clinked softly as he set it aside. "It's been 12 years. You'd think it would get easier. But it just grows quieter. Like something you forgot to water." Scout tilted his head, eyes fixed on the man. Then gently, he leaned his body against George's leg. George let out a quiet laugh, more breath than sound. "You get it, don't you?" he whispered. No words needed. That evening, Amelia sat at her kitchen table with Scout dozing at her feet. She scrolled through photos from the last few weeks. Scout curled under Oliver's desk, Scout looking up from the reading circle, Scout wagging his tail at George in the hallway. Then, on impulse, she sent a few to Natalie. She added a caption, "Thought you might like to see how he's doing." Minutes later, a photo came back. Benny was holding up a crayon drawing of Scout, the scarf around his neck now red with hearts drawn along the sides. Underneath, Benny had written in clumsy block letters, "I love you forever." Amelia stared at it for a long time. Outside, the snow fell in quiet, relentless waves. And somewhere in Rutland, a little boy looked at that scarf and whispered goodnight to the memory of a dog he'd never really lost. It was on a morning washed in sunlight and brittle frost that Amelia first considered the idea of therapy dog training. Scout had now been part of the school for nearly a month. His presence had quietly but profoundly transformed the rhythm of the classroom. The children had adjusted to him not as a novelty, but as something sacred and steady, like the bell that marked the beginning of the day or the faint scent of markers clinging to the carpet. That morning, as she guided her class through a winter poetry session, she found Oliver sitting unusually straight at his desk. The boy's pale hands clutched a folded piece of paper, his lips twitching with nerves. Scout lay nearby, his body stretched comfortably across a sunlit patch of the floor, head resting on his paws. Oliver kept glancing between the dog and the paper, as if waiting for a signal. When Amelia gently asked if anyone would like to read their poem aloud, Oliver raised his hand. The class turned. There was a moment of stunned silence. Amelia smiled with care. "Go ahead, Oliver. We're listening." Oliver stood. His poem was short, written in crayon-scrawled handwriting. His voice was low but steady. "Snow doesn't scare me when Scout is near. His eyes are brave. His tail is calm. He never asks me to be louder, he just listens until I thaw." There were no giggles, no whispers, just stillness. And then, soft applause from the other students. Oliver sat down, cheeks flushed but proud. Scout blinked once and thumped his tail on the floor. That night, while grading papers with Scout asleep beside her, Amelia searched Therapy Dog Training Vermont. A local organization, Pine Meadow Canine Services, offered weekend classes in nearby Montpelier. She read the requirements twice: temperament testing, obedience basics, exposure to children, crowds, unexpected noise. Scout had already passed all those tests in the wild. She clicked apply. Saturday arrived with icy roads and sun cutting across the hills like blades of glass. Amelia packed a bag of supplies, treats, water, Scout's vet records, and drove with him nestled in the passenger seat of her Subaru, nose to the cracked window. The training center was nestled among sugar maple trees, with a barn converted into a heated training space. Inside, a handful of other dogs gathered with their handlers, each curious and eager. Scout stood out immediately, not because he barked or strained on his leash, but because he didn't. He entered the barn with quiet confidence, ears perked, tail gently wagging. While some dogs yanked or barked at the sight of each other, Scout simply observed, then sat at Amelia's heel without being asked. The instructor, a woman in her late 40s named Margaret Cole, ran the program with crisp efficiency and warm eyes. She had a cropped salt and pepper pixie cut, wore hiking boots and a flannel jacket over jeans, and carried herself with a kind of pragmatic grace. She had worked with therapy animals for over 20 years. "Scout, is it?" she asked, crouching down. "Mind if I introduce myself?" Scout stepped forward, sniffed her hand, then licked her knuckles once. Margaret smiled. "Smart boy. Calm boy. That's good." They began with simple exercises, walking beside wheelchairs, responding to sudden sounds, ignoring distractions. Scout excelled. But what caught Margaret's attention wasn't just obedience, it was attentiveness. "He reads the room," she told Amelia during a break. "He doesn't just listen, he sees." Back at school, something else had begun to change. Each Friday, the school bulletin board outside the library was updated with student art and announcements. But last Friday, a poem had appeared, neatly typed and signed. It read, "He watches the halls without sound for feet on tile, soft and proud. A soldier not in war but peace, the silent kind who grants release." Amelia had stared at it for a long time. The words were simple, but their rhythm rang with something older, something weathered and honest. And she recognized the font, not from a computer, but from an old typewriter, the very kind George Whitman kept in his supply closet, the one he claimed didn't work. She didn't say anything, but later that day, she taped the poem back up with new thumbtacks, carefully, reverently. The following week, another poem appeared. This one about frost on windows, a town waking under snow, and a warm breath curled beside boots. Again and signed. Again, unmistakably George's. She passed him in the hall that afternoon. He was repairing a broken coat hook. "Nice poem," she said casually. He paused without looking up. "What poem?" "The one about the four-legged guard." Must have been a student, he replied, then gave her a rare wink and moved on. Amelia smiled, heart full. The transformation was spreading like candlelight, quiet and warm, and passed from hand to hand. Later that month, after Scout completed his 5th training session and passed his initial evaluations, Margaret handed Amelia a temporary badge for him. Therapy dog in training. She clipped it gently to Scout's collar. He wagged his tail once and leaned against her thigh as if to say, "We're doing okay." Back in the classroom, Oliver had begun helping a younger student with reading. Other children started asking to sit near Scout during silent time. Scout didn't bark. He didn't perform. He simply was. And somehow that was enough. Amelia stayed late one evening, updating her classroom journal. Scout was curled up on the rug. On the whiteboard, someone had written, "Scout helps my heart feel like it's not hiding anymore." She didn't erase it. The wind had changed. That morning in Brattleboro, it came sweeping down from the north in long sighs that bent the trees and set wind chimes rattling like tiny bones. Amelia pulled her coat tighter as she clipped Scout's new therapy vest into place, a soft navy blue with a patch that read "Certified Therapy Dog in Training." Scout sat still, patient as always, allowing her to fuss with the straps and smooth the fabric along his back. His ears twitched once when she zipped her bag, but otherwise he waited in quiet anticipation. They were heading to the University Children's Hospital in Burlington, nearly 2 hours away. Margaret Cole, the trainer from Pine Meadow, had personally recommended Scout for a trial visit. "I've only seen a few dogs take to that environment naturally," she'd said. "He's one of them. He doesn't soothe with tricks, he soothes with presence." The drive was long and white and silent. Scout sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the fields blur past, head tilted, nose occasionally twitching at the faint scent of snow through the air vents. Amelia glanced at him. "You ready for this, buddy?" she asked. He blinked once, then placed his paw gently on her thigh. She smiled. "I'll take that as a yes." The hospital loomed like a modern castle, gray glass, clean lines, and the strange stillness that all hospitals carry. Inside, nurses wore pastel scrubs and tired smiles. They greeted Scout with interest and careful optimism. "We've had dogs visit before," one said, "but there's something calm about him." They were taken to the pediatric oncology wing, where children's laughter mingled with hushed voices and the low hum of machines. A nurse named Jasmine led them to room 207. She was in her late 20s, petite with auburn braids pinned neatly under a patterned cap, and eyes that had clearly seen more than her age should allow. "There's someone I think Scout should meet first," she said quietly. Inside the room was a little girl named Mia. Mia was 9 years old and looked much smaller. Her skin was pale, her cheeks slightly sunken, and her head was bald beneath a pink knit cap dotted with cartoon stars. Her foreline trailed from her arm like a fragile ribbon. She sat in bed, legs drawn up, staring out the window with an expression far too solemn for someone her age. "She hasn't spoken in 5 days, Jasmine whispered. "She refuses visitors. Barely eats." Scout didn't need prompting. He walked in, unhurried, and stopped at the edge of the bed. He looked up at Mia, then sat down and waited. For a moment, she didn't even acknowledge him. But then, slowly, her eyes shifted. Her lips parted slightly, not in speech, but in something softer, a recognition. Scout lowered himself onto his belly and rested his chin gently on the side of her mattress. He didn't whine, didn't lick, just stayed. Still. Steady. Mia blinked, and for the first time in days, a breath passed her lips with no effort. The nurse pressed a hand to her mouth. For the next 20 minutes, Scout didn't move. Mia reached out once, almost shyly, and let her fingers graze the fur between his ears. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. When Scout finally closed his eyes, so did she. Amelia watched from the door, hands folded over her chest, heart aching in the quietest, deepest way. Later, when they moved on to other rooms, children reached out for Scout like sunlight, some whispering his name, others simply hugging him wordlessly. One little boy with brittle bone disease cradled his head and whispered, "You smell like warm." Another, with bandages wrapped around his chest, giggled when Scout licked his wrist. Meanwhile, across the state, another healing moment was unfolding. George Whitman stood alone at the cemetery. It had taken him years to return. The path to Margaret's grave was cleared, though dusted with new snow. He carried with him a small photo in a weathered frame. Margaret, younger and laughing, her arm around a German shepherd with one ear flopped forward. Rocky had been the dog who stayed through chemo, who lay by her hospital bed in her final weeks. George had never forgiven himself for how quietly he'd shut down after she passed. Now he stood before the gravestone, wool cap clutched in his hands. "I'm sorry I stopped visiting," he murmured, his voice like sandpaper. "I didn't know how to grieve without breaking." He placed the photo down beside the stone, then removed a folded piece of fabric from his coat pocket. It was a scarf, hand-stitched, seafoam green, the edges still rough. He'd spent nights sewing it, thread clumsy in his fingers, but driven by something unspoken. It was the same shade as Scout's original scarf, the one that Benny had tied around his dog's neck with trembling hands. "I see him in Scout sometimes," George continued. "That stillness, that loyalty. I thought I'd lost everything when you left, but maybe some pieces come back in different forms." He laid the scarf down gently, like a prayer. Then he stood in silence, letting the wind carry the words he could no longer speak. That evening, when Amelia returned from the hospital, Scout curled up by the door and slept longer than usual. Whatever energy he had given during the day had been immense. Amelia covered him with a soft fleece blanket and placed the therapy badge beside his head like a medal of quiet valor. She made tea and opened her laptop. A new email blinked in her inbox. It was from Jasmine, the nurse. "Mia smiled tonight. Told me Scout looked like a dream she used to have. She wants him to come back. Just thought you should know." Amelia exhaled and reached down to stroke the space between Scout's shoulders. "We'll go back," she whispered. "As many times as they need." It was a Friday morning gilded in soft winter sun, the kind of rare golden light that made even the frost look forgiving. Amelia stood at her classroom window, watching the courtyard as snow melted in slow rivulets along the pavement cracks. Her heart fluttered, not from nerves but from the weight of anticipation. Today, Benny was coming. Natalie had written earlier in the week, gently asking if it would be possible to visit. Not to take Scout back, she'd made that clear, but simply to let Benny see him again. "He still talks to Scout before bed," she wrote. "Still sets out an old bowl for him on the porch like he's just coming home late." Amelia replied with an enthusiastic yes. The plan was simple. Natalie would bring Benny to school at the end of the day, just after the final bell, when the classrooms began to empty and the building softened into its weekend hush. Scout, as if sensing something special, had been on edge all morning, not anxious, just alert. His ears perked at every sound. He didn't nap during reading time. When Oliver read aloud from Charlotte's Web, Scout sat upright, tail swishing in slow, deliberate arcs across the rug. At 2:45 p.m., the front doors opened. George Whitman stood in the hallway near the gym, wiping his hands with a rag after adjusting a loose heating vent. He looked up just as Natalie and Benny entered. The boy walked with measured steps, clutching something wrapped in brown paper. His frame had grown slightly since Scout last saw him, his legs longer, hair thicker, but his eyes were unmistakably the same, deep, wide, and searching. Natalie was in her early 30s, tall and slender with long, dark blonde hair swept into a loose bun. Her face bore gentle features, lightly lined from years of holding back worry. She wore a thick olive coat, frayed at the cuffs, and carried a nervous grace about her, the kind of woman who often smiled out of politeness but rarely out of joy. George watched as Amelia met them at the door. Scout, already halfway down the hall, paused. Then he froze. His ears tilted forward, head cocked slightly. A second passed. Then another. And then he bolted. Amelia barely had time to say Scout before the German shepherd dashed down the corridor, claws clicking on tile. Benny dropped the wrapped package just as Scout launched into him. Not with force, but with such velocity of joy that it swept them both to the ground in a tangle of limbs, fur, and laughter. Scout let out a sound that wasn't quite a bark, but more like a breathless whine, half howl, as if the memory of waiting had finally exhaled. Benny threw his arms around Scout's neck, burying his face in the thick fur, sobbing openly. "I missed you so much," he cried. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to leave you. I didn't want to leave." Scout stayed pressed against him, unmoving except for the rapid wag of his tail, beating like a metronome against the floor. Natalie stood with one hand over her mouth, eyes brimming. Amelia approached quietly and placed a hand on her shoulder. "He never stopped waiting for him," she whispered. After a long moment, Benny sat up and unwrapped the brown paper he had dropped. Inside was a deep red scarf, stitched along the edge in uneven white thread. Scout always brave. "I made it with my aunt," Benny said, holding it out. "It took me a long time." Amelia knelt and helped Benny tie it around Scout's neck. "He looks proud," she said softly. "I think he is," Benny replied. The moment lingered in the hallway like a blessing. Around them, The school grew quiet, the end-of-day shuffle fading into silence. George remained near the stairwell, half in shadow, not yet moving. His eyes never left the boy and the dog. Later, as the sun slipped lower in the sky and the school began to empty completely, George approached Amelia outside her classroom. Scout lay beside her desk, his new red scarf vivid against his fur, Benny's scent still clinging to it. George held something in his hand, a square of fabric, carefully folded. "I never finished this for Rocky," he said. "Started it the winter before Margaret passed, then put it away after. But well, Scout's earned it more than anyone I know." He handed it to her. It was a scarf, soft green, a few shades lighter than Scout's original one. The stitching was delicate but imperfect, clearly hand-done. At one corner, a tiny line of words had been sewn. "Hope doesn't vanish. It just waits." Amelia looked up at him, touched beyond words. "I thought," George added, clearing his throat, "maybe you could keep it, or give it to someone who needs to remember." Amelia nodded. "I think Scout already has." George gave her a quiet smile, the kind that seemed to unfold from old, locked places. Funny how one dog can change a whole building. She glanced at Scout, now resting peacefully beneath the window, tail thumping softly in his sleep. "Not just a building," she said. "He's changed the people in it." As the last of the day's light painted the classroom in amber, Scout slept with his head tucked beneath his new red scarf, heart full, the ache of separation finally laid to rest. And outside, beneath the frozen maple trees, George Whitman walked home slower than usual, hands in his pockets, the wind tugging gently at his coat, but not at his heart. Spring crept into Brattleboro the way dawn breaks on a snow-covered window, quiet, hesitant, almost invisible at first. The icicles that once clung to the eaves of the school were now just damp streaks on brick. The snowbanks shrank each day, revealing patches of muddy grass and sidewalks lined with forgotten leaves. Beneath the earth, something was shifting, and in the hearts of many in that small town, something was healing too. Scout, now a certified therapy dog, wore his navy vest with practiced pride. The badge beneath his name was no longer temporary. It gleamed silver against his sable fur, catching the light when he walked through school hallways or padded silently between rows of books at the Brattleboro Public Library. The librarian, Ms. Chambers, a willowy woman in her late 60s who wore shawls and smelled faintly of chamomile, always kept a blanket laid out near the children's corner just for him. Every Tuesday afternoon, kids read to Scout in hushed, reverent tones, some stumbling over syllables, others giggling mid-sentence as Scout rested his head in their laps. At the hospital, his visits had become part of the routine. Nurses would smile when they saw him in the lobby, and the children would perk up as soon as they heard the familiar click of his paws on the tile. Mia, now stronger and full of color, had a new tradition. Scout would lie beside her during chemo, and she'd whisper made-up stories about a dog knight who guarded a magical forest. Scout never interrupted. He simply listened. One afternoon, the Brattleboro Gazette ran a front-page story titled, "Scout the Keeper of Winter Warmth." The article featured a photo of Scout lying at the foot of a hospital bed, his red scarf vivid against a white sheet. The story told of his rescue, his training, and his quiet impact across schools, libraries, and children's wards. Amelia clipped the article and pinned it in her classroom next to Oliver's first poem. That same week, she received over 24 emails from parents, local educators, and even strangers who had read the article online and wanted to thank her, and Scout, for restoring their belief in quiet miracles. Oliver, once a boy of shadows and silence, now spoke with clarity and joy. He had taken to writing poetry weekly, and had even started helping a younger classmate with reading. His newest piece, scribbled in colorful ink on construction paper, read, "Scout doesn't wear a crown, but he walks like a king of comfort." But the most unexpected transformation happened in George. That Monday morning, as the gym was cleared and chairs arranged for the school's spring celebration, George stood at the back of the room holding a piece of paper. His hands, rough from years of labor, trembled slightly. Amelia, noticing him there, walked over with a soft smile. "You sure?" she asked. George gave a slow nod. "Reckon it's time." The principal, a cheerful man named Mr. Bellamy with a round belly and suspenders that never quite matched his ties, had agreed to let George close the ceremony. "Something different this year," he had said. Something from the heart of the building. As students filed in and teachers settled, Scout waited patiently beside the small wooden stage, red scarf tied neat and proud. The gym buzzed with spring energy, students fidgeting, Paper flowers taped to windows, banners reading "New Beginnings." When George was introduced, a few of the younger children looked surprised. They were used to seeing him mop floors, not step to the front with paper in hand. But as he climbed the steps, the room grew still. George cleared his throat. "I don't speak much," he began, his voice gravelly but steady. "But I've seen a lot. I've seen cold days and broken heaters and kids lose gloves and sometimes their hope. And I've seen one dog remind us what staying means." He looked down at Scout, who sat just off stage, alert still. "I wrote something," George continued. "Not for applause. Just for sharing." Then he read, "When winter came and the windows cried, he walked these halls and never lied. With silent steps and knowing gaze, he warmed our days in quiet ways. He never judged nor turned away, just stayed and softened all the gray. And through his eyes, we learned to see that healing starts in loyalty." The room held its breath. Scout wagged his tail once, a single, soft beat against the gym floor. Then the applause rose, not loud and wild, but slow and full, like a rising tide. George gave a small, crooked smile, the first real one Amelia had seen, and stepped down. That night, after the gym had emptied and Scout lay asleep beneath her desk, Amelia found George in the parking lot beneath a blooming maple. He held a small slip of paper, his old flip phone balanced on one knee. "I called him," he said, voice low. Amelia paused. "Your son?" George nodded. "Got an address too. He's in Pennsylvania now. He said he'd like to talk." She didn't speak, only reached over and squeezed his hand. Spring came fully to Brattleboro in the days that followed. The snow melted for good, and the trees whispered in soft green buds. Children filled the playground with shouts again, and birds returned to windowsills and rooftops. Scout stayed with Amelia. He had a new bed by the back porch, but preferred lying at her feet while she graded papers. Some evenings, she'd find him staring out at the fading sunset, the red scarf still around his neck, ears twitching at the sounds of life beyond the glass. Oliver, Scout, and George were often seen together after school. Oliver reading aloud, Scout resting his head on George's boot, and George quietly whittling small animal shapes from leftover wood. One day, George handed Oliver a carving of a dog with floppy ears and a tiny stitched scarf. "Looks like Scout," Oliver said. George just nodded. And in that little town where winter had once wrapped itself around so many wounded hearts, the thaw came not just to the streets, but to the souls within them. Slowly, gently, entirely. Final message: what Scout taught us sometimes, God doesn't send angels with wings. He sends them on 4 legs, with quiet eyes and hearts too big for their bodies. Scout didn't speak, didn't preach, didn't promise. He simply stayed, through cold mornings, broken hearts, and quiet sorrows. In a world that rushes and forgets, Scout reminded us of the holy power of presence. He showed that healing doesn't always come with loud declarations. It often arrives in silence, curled up beside us, listening. Maybe that's the miracle, that God uses the small and the humble, the overlooked and the wounded, to stitch us back together. That a boy with anxiety finds courage in a wagging tail. That an old man finds forgiveness through a dog's quiet companionship. That a whole town remembers hope through one scarf, one child, one dog. In our own lives, we may not all meet a Scout, but we are all called to be a Scout. To sit beside someone when they're afraid. To listen without fixing. To love without needing thanks. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing is possible. That faith still works. That love, in its quietest form, still saves. Leave a comment below saying amen if you believe in second chances, in the power of love, and in God's quiet miracles. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of hope and healing. Share this story with someone going through a hard season. You never know what small miracle your kindness might spark. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May His comfort be as close as a faithful dog on a cold morning. Amen.